Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. Okay, we're here with Professor Nicholas Rivers from the University of Ottawa. I figured we should have a talk about this MOU signed with Alberta and whether or not I'm reading it in really bad faith in terms of what some of the climate stuff in there is. I guess why don't we start with the thing that jumped out at me is it talks about going to net zero, but then it talks about intensity reductions. And I don't know if that math is. Why don't we start there in terms of what the stated goals are around those reductions and the fact that they focus very much on intensity in the language?
Yeah, good point. If we were serious about getting to net zero emissions by 2050, I think an intensity standard can get us there. You just set the intensity to zero, right? So that
Okay.
means that you can produce as much whatever it is as you want with 0 tons of greenhouse gas per unit of production, and there we go. We're all set. We're going to achieve net zero emissions. So if you believe that's where we're headed, that I don't have a problem with intensity-based standards. But I think you're right to call into question how aligned this is with net zero.
Mhm.
Um, in fact, uh, in another part of the memorandum, uh, it it talks about achieving world-leading greenhouse gas intensity for heavy oil production by 2050. And if we are, truly headed towards a net zero world, we shouldn't be producing a lot of heavy oil by 2050.
Yeah.
So I think that's a more glaring kind of discontinuity with the promise of net zero than the intensity-based approach.
Yeah, for sure. Especially because if they are planning to build this pipeline, which the language in the MOU seems to indicate they are, that would mean increased production, which means that even if you are producing less intense emissions per barrel, you're still increasing the barrels. So your overall emissions would still be going up.
Right. So this is partly an accounting question, which is all these greenhouse gas geeks that like, I'm one of them. Um, think about emissions in a particular way, which is maybe not the way that regular people think about emissions. They think about emissions according to the way that the international system for accounting for these emissions works, which is that the emissions are for oil production, the emissions that are in Canada's domain are
Mhm.
the ones that we emit in producing the oil.
Right.
But those are only a small fraction of the emissions that are ultimately released from the oil, right? When you actually burn the oil, that's where most of the emissions come out.
Right.
And so this is where this kind of discontinuity or comes from, is the fact that we could be producing a whole bunch of oil and trying to limit the emissions, not to zero upstream, according to this thing, but to world
Right.
leading. Still a lot of emissions, but they're ignoring completely the downstream emissions that come from burning the oil. So
Okay.
that's kind of in keeping with the international greenhouse gas accounting system, but it also, to me, um, doesn't position us to be a really big contributor on net zero worldwide.
For sure. Um, Something else that the MOU places a lot of trust in is the Pathways project, which, for those viewers who are unaware, is a carbon capture, storage, and utilization program owned by 6 oil companies with the intention of capturing and funneling these emissions to underground storage. I was not aware until yesterday that Pathways is only intended to capture about 12% of emissions. Is that your understanding?
I am not 100% certain. I went to
Okay.
the Pathways website, and it talks about a range of 4 to 60 megatons of capture. That's a 15-fold range. So I feel like the specifics are not super clear.
Okay.
It also, I would say, in the MOU talks about phase one of pathways. So I would be inclined to think that's on the low side of emission reductions, but I couldn't find substantiating details.
Okay.
Um, Again, even with a high capture rate, the bulk of emissions come from burning the fuel,
Right.
not from producing it. So it's still important for us to be trying to be as low greenhouse gas as possible on the production side, but that doesn't do anything for the downstream side, which is where most of the emissions come from.
Okay.
So I do think
Um,
it's not a negligible commitment. I mean,
mhm.
whether it's 4 or 12 or 20 megatons of emissions a year, that's not nothing.
Yeah.
Um, but I think you have to think about this in the context of the other parts of the MOU. If you're trying to think about like parse the overall environmental impact
Mhm.
of this MOU. And as you know, there's basically some horse trading here, right? The
Yeah.
federal government is agreeing to suspend the clean electricity regulations and suspend or eliminate the underdevelopment oil and gas cap. Um, and in exchange, they're going to get this pathways. They're
Mhm.
going to give an easier pathway to the pipeline, and there's hope for tightening the stringency of the industrial carbon pricing regime. So it's a whole big swath of things. I
Mhm.
think there's no way to look at this without thinking that the net impact of this MOU is going to be, if it all goes through, is going to be an increase in emissions. And on the other side of things, we should see an increase in oil production and potentially an increase in economic security as we divert some oil away from the U.S. and potentially divert it to Asia. And so
Right.
I think that's the trade-off that we're seeing here: more
Yeah.
emissions and more oil production as a result.
Yeah. The clean electricity regulations was kind of the next point I wanted to get to was because in the stuff we were reading about Stephen Gilboa's exit, one of the points he had apparently made was that in order for the industrial carbon price to offset the emissions that were expected from the or reductions from the clean electricity regulations, the carbon price would need to be somewhere in the area of $400 a ton. And I'm wondering if that's a figure that sounds right to you, or if that was possibly exaggeration.
No, I would say that's the kind of ballpark number that I would have expected as well. It's hard to get this exactly right, right? It's
Right.
these are model-based estimates, and we don't know what the future holds. But the CER, the Clean Electricity Regulations, were pretty stringent. They tried to get much of the CO2 out of the system by 2035, the electricity system, by basically saying if you have an electricity generating unit, it essentially has to be zero emissions by 2035 with lots of exceptions. So
Right.
if it's going to be something that strains the system too much, or if it's there to support wind and solar, then there's going to be exceptions. But the kind of overall intent was to make the the electricity system greenhouse gas neutral by 2035, with a decline or increasing stringency through 2050.
Right.
And it's expensive to get emissions out of the electricity system. It's not expensive to start getting them out. So when we
Mhm.
can get some emissions out today at very low cost, and in fact, we're seeing significant progress on reducing emissions in the electricity sector in Canada and around the world because it's quite cheap. But when
Yeah.
you try to get all the emissions out, that's where it starts getting expensive. And so I think that this is what the CER was trying to do by 2050, and it's not surprising to see that last bit of squeezing out of emissions of the electricity sector was quite expensive. And so we shouldn't expect even a tightened industrial carbon price to do that. And
Yeah.
I would think some parties would look at that and say, okay, that's a good thing. We don't want to be imposing really high carbon prices in a particular sector. And other people are going to look at it and say, oh, that's a really bad thing. We're giving up emission reductions that we would have gotten under the clean electricity regulations.
Yeah, I mean there certainly seems to be a debate as to whether, you should just use the pricing mechanism and none, and let the market kind of decide that way. and don't use the other regulatory mechanisms at all, and just kind of have a more pure pricing system. But again, the flip side of that tends to be, well, that could mean a really high carbon price on the flip side. So it's certainly a debate that I kind of hear around me
Yeah,
as
that's
all
the
this is
debate.
happening.
Exactly right. So I think, and certainly that's the way economists frame the debate, and I'm one of them. The rule for economists is we want everyone facing the same pressure to reduce emissions, the same price to reduce emissions, and that's going to result in the situation where no one's going to be like overexerting themselves, like maybe in the electricity sector, and
Hmm.
someone else gets a free ride. That's not the situation you want. You want everyone to have this kind of consistent pressure to reduce emissions that's reflected by a uniform carbon price. And so, in an economic world, you don't want to be like pushing really hard in some sectors and giving other sectors an easier ride, which is what these sector specific regulations arguably do. On the flip side, these sector specific regulations give you a good backup when the carbon price doesn't work very well. And
Yeah.
that's the situation we found ourselves in. Um, the rules that govern industrial carbon pricing are different in every province. It's pretty easy. It's turned out to be pretty easy for provinces to weaken this system because there's such complicated rules that are hard to kind of regulate at the federal level. And obviously, provinces have a lot of jurisdiction to set their own rules. And so we've ended up, instead of having like a uniform price signal that gets everyone to work pretty hard to reduce emissions, we've got a uniform price signal that's pretty weak, and so no one's really reducing emissions that much. And so, the flip side of this argument is
Hmm.
maybe these sector-specific regulations do preserve some climate action, even when in the face of this weak carbon price.
Yeah, and that was kind of my last point was the Alberta carbon price and the rules there. I There was a really interesting piece in the CBC last night about the way Alberta's carbon price works, and apparently there's a lot of problems with these emission credits that they are giving out, which essentially reduces the burden even further for very little cost on the part of industry. And I'm wondering if that's also your kind of understanding.
Yeah, I've been reading these regulations in the last months to try to come up with a proposal for tightening them, and they are complicated. They're hard to parse. They mix legal concepts and economic concepts, so it's hard for any expert to read them and understand them completely without a good background in both of those areas.
Yeah.
They're super detailed in that they often prescribe, there's one for each province basically, and they often
Mhm.
prescribe particular things for particular facilities, right? So it's like this facility has to do such and such. The thing they have to do, which is not that hard to understand, is achieve a performance standard. So if you're a facility, Dale, that produces cement, I'm going to write a performance standard that says you've got to produce your cement with no more than this amount of pollution per unit of cement produced, no more than 1 ton of CO2 produced for every kilogram of cement you produce. That would be a lot, but whatever. So I make that rule,
Yeah.
and um, I have a lot of discretion as the government, as a government in a province, of what that rule is, what that performance standard is, and effectively, that's what creates the credits. If you're below that amount, I give you credits.
Yeah.
So where I set that amount determines how many credits you get. And what it's turned out to be difficult to do is to police this kind of initial performance standard, which determines how much credits get sold for, how many credits get generated, and as a result, what they get sold for.
Okay.
Um, so what we've all been sold is this what's a price, kind of you could think of it as a reserve price. Like if you need a credit and you haven't got it through some other way of getting a credit, then a government will offer to sell you at this reserve price, which is the price that the federal government and governments in provinces have written on their websites. But it's
Hmm.
not the price that's actually used because there's so many credits floating around in the markets that this headline price hasn't been used all that much. So the
Okay.
effective price is lower than the price that's kind of written on the tin.
All right. Well, that's also
I
good
know it's a
context to
it's a
have.
it's a hard thing to explain quickly, but I
Yeah.
think the problem is we're not getting the carbon price that is written in the federal government legislation, for example. So that's
Yeah.
what we've kind of set up our emission reduction plans around, and it's not what's materialized.
Okay. Well, that's It's really interesting to know. All right. Well, I think those are all my questions for today. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
My pleasure.
And
Yeah. Nice to
yeah,
talk to you.
hopefully we'll chat again in the future.
Okay. All the best.
All right. Cheers.
Bye.
And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. It's at journo_Dale on Twitter and journodale no underscore on Bluesky. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.